Okay, keep going.
Should we go back to Nana?
You could do that.
We can skip the rent part when she was yelling to go get the rents. But how about when she started working at you? Actually, yeah. Start where. Are you recording it now?
Yeah.
Oh.
Right?
So start where did Nana work when she went to the shirt
She
factory?
worked at Cloyd Peabody.
I know. First, I'm like, in Peabody?
I know.
No.
Okay, so she worked every day
Yeah,
and walked home for
I
lunch.
walked home for lunch, fed me, then walked back, and
I got him now.
That is so cute.
Isn't it?
I'm sorry. Go back to the story.
That's the grandkid mug.
That is so cute.
yeah, it is.
So she would come home and she would feed you lunch.
Yeah,
And
and,
then after dinner, after work, she'd walk and get groceries.
Yeah.
When did she pick her blueberries? Because that's all I remember. After she
Well, that
was
was
retired,
in August.
She didn't have
usually,
time to, like,
late
pick
July,
blueberries
early
then?
August.
or on the weekend, I suppose.
We walked up. That to her, that was recreation.
So you when you owned the sixth family, when did you lose it? Like,
We lost it. I don't remember. I was only probably a year old at that time. But the bank obviously foreclosed on it because they couldn't pay anything. And I said he got a job on the WPA.
oh right.
And his work was, and the work was that they'd make your work for them basically. And I know what he was done. He had a pot of tar and a long pole with a brush on the end, and they went out and they painted the nests of gypsy moths. A gypsy, you've never seen
Yeah.
it? Have
Well,
you ever
yeah.
seen a
we do
gypsy
the
moth
foil.
nest?
Yeah, we do the foil around the bark or whatever, around the
Oh.
tree trunk.
Okay, well that's new.
They would
Because you
tar them
could
to
go out into
stop
the
it.
woods and you could see these big webs,
Right.
of gypsy moths. So they would paint those enough to.
Was that when the
survive.
Depression was on its way coming back?
No, that
or
was,
that
that
was
was in the
in the-
beginning.
So you were, grew up during the Depression.
I was born in '29. Depression started. The stock market crashed in '29, and from that point on, everyone was just out of work. Everything collapsed.
Right.
You know, they used to say people were jumping out of
Windows.
windows.
and-
You
yeah.
know, businessmen who suddenly had lost everything. So it was interesting. One of the stories that to me told the difference between my mother and my father. I remember one time I was probably 6 or 8, and we were sitting out on the front porch, and my mother would cook the meal, and most of the time she would clean up. I mean, us kids would probably do the dishes. I remember doing that. I don't remember doing it at that time, but probably Bill and Barbara did it. They were 4 or 5 years older than me. But we were sitting out on the porch. I know I was there, my father was there, and I'm sure Bill and Barb were there. And in this 6 apartment house across the street lived some rather decrepit families. I mean,
Poorer than
the
you
house
guys.
was never really taken care of when the bank took over. I don't think they ever did any repairs, and it wasn't like today where there's an organization,
Right.
hire someone who forces
comes in, yeah.
people to
Condemned or whatever.
condemn
you
it
can't live
or
it, yeah.
change it or update it or repair it. So anyway, there was a rather large family, about 4 or 5 kids anyway, and the woman was basically a prostitute. Every Saturday night, she would walk down to McCann's Cafe, which was the first group of stores before you got into the center of town. There were a row of 4 or 5 storefronts. And she'd pick up a soldier from Fort Devens, and God only know what went on.
Well, you gotta make your money somehow.
Kids gotta eat.
Well,
It wasn't
anyway,
a bar. It was like a cafe.
bar,
Or do you
cafe,
remember? Oh, same thing.
Yeah.
same thing, really.
Well, when you say
It was-
cafe, I think
it
of
was
like
a
coffee
bar.
shop.
Right.
You know,
Right.
a cafe is you can get food. I
Right.
don't know whether they served anything but
Beer and
yeah,
whiskey.
well, pickled eggs and pickled
Oh.
feet. You know, I mean, they used to have those big jars on
Yeah.
the bar.
Yeah.
So anyway, this woman comes along. She crossed the street from her house and was coming along in front of our house. And my father always wore a hat outside. He tipped his hat and said, "Good evening, ma'am," just as my mother came to the door to ask a question
Oh, I
about
know
something.
this
Did I tell you this?
story. Yeah. Keep going.
Did I tell you this?
I don't know.
So,
But I can picture Nana.
yeah, well,
She not being happy.
she stood there with her hands on her hips and she said, "Hector, the very idea. That woman's nothing but a..." And he said, "Gladys, she's a human being, just like us." And to me, that always symbolized the difference between my father and my mother. My father had the ability to just reach out and accept people where they were. My mother, if it was family, they were all right. If it wasn't family, you can't trust them. You know.
Who's that sound like?
Me?
No.
I'm teasing.
Who does that sound like?
No, I think it just sounds like you and Mom.
Yeah, Mom didn't trust anybody.
No.
I wasn't that way. I'm the one who kept in touch with the family.
No, he's saying that that's between, like,
The difference
the
between.
difference between you and Mom as
right.
well.
Right.
That Mom
Well, they
did.
always
And
say.
I mean, there were times maybe that you weren't as open or whatever,
Oh, I'm sure.
but I mean, if
They
I was
say
to
you always-
generalize something,
Yeah, they say you always marry your mother.
there you
Well, anyway. So that.
What do they
That would
say?
be for you.
But yeah,
What about us?
What do we do?
go. Do we marry our fathers?
No, my choices couldn't have been any different from my father.
I was also thinking of this morning when I was doing my Al-Anon readings. I was thinking of the awareness that that comes of sharing your inner, your deeper feelings. And I remember one time, this was years and years ago, I was talking to my sister, and for whatever reason, I started to share something that was, and I don't even remember what it was, but something that was very personal and emotional to me. And my sister listened, and then she changed the subject and talked about something else. And I felt as though I had been slapped.
Mm.
You know, that I was aware of that as I was reading this passage this morning. I thought how difficult it is to share one's emotions. And you're mentioning trust, I think, brought this thing up to me right now. That you have to trust someone in order to be able to tell what you're really feeling inside. Things that you really don't want everyone to know.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Interesting. I've got less concerned about that as I've gotten older.
If someone's wanting to hear what you have to share, or
Yeah.
willing to accept what you have to share.
Well, I'm more willing to be open about
Right.
things.
And if they take it, they take it, and if they don't, they
Yeah.
don't.
But you know after a period of time. Now, for example, my bowling friends, I wouldn't try to share any deep feeling with them
Right.
because they wouldn't know what to do with it.
Right.
Everything is, surface. And so much of that is what goes on,
Right.
and it's not satisfying.
Right.
It prevents us from really being open and being comfortable with ourselves. Thank God for Al-Anon, where I can go and talk
Right,
about what I
right.
feel
Right.
and have an open forum. Well, we didn't get very far. Let me go back to talk about my grandparents.
Oh, I don't think I've ever heard about them.
On my mother's side, my grandfather was probably French, because he spoke French growing up.
Of course he was, because I claim to be French, which is when people ask what my
French
origin
Canadian.
is. No, I say French. Say I'm French.
Well, that's partly true. And my grandmother, her maiden name was Brobecker, which is German.
Oh.
And
interesting.
my grandfather's name was McGrath.
Which is
But-
what?
Well, they have traced it. One of my second or third level cousins did trace the genealogy, and traced it back to Alsace-Lorraine, which was that area between France and Germany that kept changing hands, depending upon who won the last war.
Right.
So over a period of time. So it was influenced by both France and Germany. And so my grandmother's name was Brobecker, and her father was the master pilot bringing ships up the St. Lawrence, because they were in Tracadie, I think, or Moncton. I'm not sure where they were originally, Moncton or Tracadie, but he was also a sheriff. So in those days, if you were connected, you could get both sort of things. And so where am I going with this? Oh, so anyway, on my grandmother's side, it was Brobecker and Russell. So English is, the Russell is English,
Yeah.
the Brobecker is German. On my grandfather's side, there was
French.
probably some Irish, because McGrath is more an Irish name, but it was with very strong French connections. So God only knows how much French and Irish there was in it.
So mainly French is right.
Yeah, I'm
So
going
you
with
can
French.
pick any one of the four,
I'm going with French.
But the interesting thing is,
Bonjour.
when I was growing up, in Leominster, and this was true of other areas too, because I've met people since then who spoke French, grew up speaking French, but they were not educated French. It was the farmer French.
Right.
And that was my grandfather was that. He was, I remember him telling me when he was 12 years old, they sent him to work in the sawmill, and he was the cook's helper. He said he was the cook, but
Right.
12 years old, I think he was the cook's helper. He may have become the cook. But then he became a carpenter. And one of the stories was that he went up to repair the steeple on the cathedral in, I think it was Moncton. That was the area diocese headquarters. And so he had gone up to the top of the steeple and repaired that. So he was a man who had some courage. But he was a man who said very little. When I was a kid, when I was 6 or 7, and we used to go on holidays, usually on Christmas and on 4th of July, and sometimes on Easter, we would go to Boston and spend it at my grandmother and my grandfather's house. And whenever we were there, the house had, the back of the house was a large kitchen, and then there were 2 rooms coming off that. One was a dining room, and there was a passage between, it was open to the dining room, and then there was a small den to the side, and that passageway went all the way down to the front door. And there was a parlor beyond that on the left side, and there was nothing on the right side except the door to outside. There might have been a room in there, but I don't remember it. And when we used to go by the through the house, if we were in the kitchen and we wanted to go to the den or upstairs, we had to go through that dining room. And my grandfather had this huge purple overstuffed chair. The arms on it were probably a foot wide. And he would sit there reading his paper. He wouldn't say a word to us. We would tiptoe through the room, afraid that he would even look at us. And I remember one time we were there, and there were 6 of us. In many ways, my grandmother and my grandfather favored my father and my mother. They used to love to come to Leominster. And I think the rest of the boys, and there were 4 of them, I know that my grandfather was pretty harsh when they grew up. So they didn't really have a strong connection. They would be there on holidays, but I don't think they had a very strong connection to their parents. For whatever reason, my mother and father, I think, were closer to them because they used to visit us. And I suppose for that reason, my grandfather, he was sitting there and he didn't have his paper yet. And 3 or 4 of us were going through the room there, and he said, "Hey," we all stopped, and he said, "Here, boy," and he was pointing to me. So I went over. He said, "Here's a dime. Get me the Boston Post, and you have a nickel for an ice cream." Other kids didn't get anything. So I got the dime. I went down and got the paper, and I got an ice cream, and I'm eating it in front of everyone else. It was that kind of situation. There wasn't a sense of belonging, as far as he was concerned. And I think he felt ostracized. And I suspect there was a lot of feelings between my grandmother and my grandfather. I remember when my grandfather died. My grandmother died in 1948. She had a heart attack. And she was a short, stocky woman. And she had a lively attitude toward life. I remember Bill and Grace, she took them to the ball game, the Red Sox game, and she gave them cigarettes. Now
How old were they?
Bill was probably 10 and she was
Oh my
probably
gosh.
11, maybe 12 and
Oh my gosh.
and 11. But she smoked, and she had that, and she used to cheat at gin. She would play cards with us, and she would cheat, and we knew it, and we would say something, and she'd just look at us. I won.
Sounds like Aunt Grace.
Who?
Aunt Grace.
No. there was a different personality behind Grace. And for a couple of years, we used to go to a camp, and the whole family would be there. Actually, we did it for a number of years, but in 2 or 3 years, it was in Billerica. We used to
Where?
call it Silver Lake.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
that's Wilmington, Tewksbury.
Oh, was that?
Uh-huh.
I always thought it was
Still there.
Billerica. Okay, we would.
Is it still
General
there?
area. There's probably like a piece that's in Billerica.
Yeah.
It was just this unfinished camp,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just the walls and the
Yeah.
studs and but large enough. And us kids, probably 10
Did
of
you guys
us,
stay there?
yeah, we'd spend the weekend there,
Oh.
the whole family. The men would play cards and drink all weekend.
And the children would smoke.
No, no, the children wouldn't smoke there. And but we would be put in one room with mattresses on the floor. You know those old blue mattresses?
That
They-
rolled up.
No, you couldn't roll them. They were, I think, they were filled with straw.
Oh,
They were
yes,
not-
I do. Yeah, those are horrible.